Well, unknowingly, I made this motion, didn't I? Became a scholar and I wanted
So are these the new pieces that came from the monastery with Christ's blood?
Yeah, they are. Yeah, so actually they were in the same place in the monastery too.
Oh, wow.
Statue of Our Lady and Statue of Saint Joseph. These, yeah, those were on the altar. Yeah.
I had the pleasure of going there twice. And it was beautiful.
Yeah. That,
It makes me wish I'd gone more now.
yeah, that was one of my favorite places. I used to go to daily mass there starting when I was in high school. Manchester is worth seeing too. It's much bigger than Fulton. The charism is very, very beautiful too. If you start learning about it.
They put out the whistles that my parents had when I was a kid, the Father's Heaven.
Yeah, Precious Blood Band.
Precious Blood Sisters. I had a fondness for them. I didn't know there were any here until too late to ever see them.
Yeah.
I had a friend try to join them.
Oh, wow.
But they refused her because she was 61. You have to be 60. But then they found out she was a nurse. And they wanted her. But then you got insulted.
Yeah, well,
The whole thing was just a sad mess.
too bad.
You know?
It's too bad.
It is too bad. It's sad. Yeah. She felt rejected. Yes.
How are you?
I'm well, how about you?
You good?
I asked Keegan, so how was it? He said, I liked it. It was short.
Oh. See, people don't tell me that often.
I get, yeah, I get that. From me too.
All right, let's begin. So today I'm going to begin with a prayer for generosity by saying Ignatius, mostly because it occurred to me when Father Dan was preaching tonight. It doesn't actually have much to do with the class. Okay, so let's begin in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Lord, teach me to be generous. Teach me to serve you as you deserve. To give and not to count the cost. To fight and not to heed the wounds. To toil and not to seek for rest. To labor and to ask for no reward, save that of knowing that I do your will. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. All right, now, for those of you who were here last week, anybody remember what we talked about at the very, very end? Well, actually, never mind the end. What basically did we talk about last week?
The rationality of belief.
The rationality of belief, right? So we talked about the witnesses who said they saw Jesus rise and whether or not we could believe them. We concluded that there were three possibilities. They were either lying, they were crazy, or they were telling the truth. They couldn't have been crazy because 500 people claimed to have seen the same thing at once. They had no reason to lie, especially not at the point of martyrdom, where they had everything to lose if Jesus did not rise at that point, and only had to gain if he actually rose. And so if they weren't crazy and they weren't lying, they must be telling the truth. Jesus must indeed be risen. But what about those people who still, even after going through this, and understanding exactly the strength of this witness testimony, what about those people who still refuse to believe the witnesses? So the example I gave was of trying to convince someone that moose exist, right? So imagine you're talking to someone from, I don't know, say New York City, who's never seen a moose before, and you try to tell them about moose. And they think this is the craziest thing they've ever heard. Such creatures cannot exist. I've never seen one. You're just pulling my leg. Right? So you try to go take him to see a moose. You take him up to Millinocket and you show them the last place you saw a moose. And unfortunately, the moose is gone right then. Right? So they don't believe your testimony that you've indeed seen a moose, and the moose are real. And they haven't seen it for themselves. So where do you go from here? And what you do is you start showing them evidence that moose were indeed there. You start pointing to the hoof prints and saying, this is what a moose's hoof looks like. Those are the footprints. You start pointing to, I don't know, broken branches in the trees that are high enough up to have been broken by a moose's antlers, but not high enough for a deer's. You start pointing to things moose leave behind, like the place where the moose slept, moose poop. What have you. You start pointing to evidences of moose. Now, what I want you to notice is, of course, this is not as persuasive as having seen a moose yourself, right? When you're looking at hoof prints, you can always say, that's a caribou print. I know. And actually, it might actually turn out to be a caribou print. If it did, would you stop believing in moose if you were the one who'd seen one? No, if you've seen a moose, even if you mistook the hoof print, you still know moose are real. But the guy you're trying to convince doesn't. Okay? Or, even if, let's say, your friend concluded, okay, I believe those hoof prints were left by something like what you described. Does that automatically lead to the conclusion that whoever left that hoof print must be, I don't know how tall, like 8 feet tall with giant antlers and a big snout? You don't know that from the hoof prints. The only thing you know is that whatever creature this was had hoof prints that looked like this. And that's about as far as you get. It can confirm pieces of your testimony. It can't always give you the whole picture. And it can always be called into question. So it's not your first go-to move. First move is to try and get them to see a moose. Your first move is actually to hope that they believe you as your friend. But then after that, you try to get them to see a moose. And only when that fails do you then fall into these proofs. Well, this is how the proofs of existence of God work. For the vast majority of people, their belief in God is based on witness testimony. Either they've had an encounter with God themselves, or they believe the witnesses who have. And that's what this is based on. But then for those who won't believe the witnesses, well, where do we go? And in fact, what we do is we start looking for God's footprints, if you will. Evidence that he has been here. Evidence that he is real. And that he actually works in this world. Again, it's not perfect, right? When we go through the proofs of the existence of God, it often shows us only a small piece of what we believe about God. It doesn't show you the whole thing. And again, it's not incontrovertible. Okay? When you've encountered God for yourself, you know for certain, and nothing will shake your faith. But when you're going through proofs of the existence of God, some people find them persuasive, some people don't. If you've had that encounter, even if you find a proof unpersuasive, your faith still won't be shaken. If you haven't had that encounter, everything's going to hang on the proof. So this is some of the dynamics that we're walking into right now. Just kind of be aware of that as we start. All right. So, where should we start looking for the footprints of God? Well, I thought a nice place to begin would be chocolate cake. Some might take this in a direction to say that the goodness of chocolate cake could only be the reflection of a purely good divinity. I could go there. I'm not going to. Instead, I want you to think about chocolate cake and where it came from. All right? So, for instance, my birthday was 2 weeks ago. Time flies. And someone made me a chocolate cake. Did that cake exist from all eternity? No. And there was a time when it was not. Currently, it is not. But that's for other reasons. Right? So how did it come into being? Did it just appear?
Made of ingredients.
It was made of ingredients. Okay, so what are some of the ingredients that we make cake out of? Flour, sugar, water, eggs, chocolate. Okay? It had a cause. Okay? It also had a baker, it had ingredients, had an oven. There are all these things that contributed to cause the cake to come into being. without which there would be no cake. And the causes themselves, you'll notice, have causes. So the sugar that went into cake, did that exist from all eternity? No, where did that come from? It was grown, right? So originally it's grown as sugar cane, and then it's processed, right? Processed through some factory. Did the factory exist from all eternity? No, that itself also has a cause. The things it's made of have causes, the things those are made of have causes, right? And you see there's this causal chain that goes back further and further and further, and it's all interconnected, intricately woven, like a giant game of dominoes, right? So here's the question then. How far back does this causal chain go? Right? And we have basically two choices. On the one hand, we could say it goes back forever. That there is no end to this chain. That this was caused by this, that was caused by this, was caused by this, on to infinity. The universe always existed. This whole chain of causes will extend infinitely in both directions. It will continue for infinity, and it began way back infinite numbers of years ago. That's one option. We call this the infinite regress. There is a second option. That this did have a beginning. That the causal chain doesn't go back infinitely, but actually has an end. Now, if this wasn't an infinite regress, right? If there was a beginning to this set of causes, then there must have been a first cause, right? If there was a first cause, if there was a domino that set all the others off, not an infinite chain of dominoes, this cause must have been different. Can anybody think of why? Right. So if it's to be actually the first cause, there could be no cause before it, because if there was a cause before it, of course, that would be the first cause, right? So the first cause is the only thing in this chain that is uncaused, right? Nothing brought it into being. Now, if nothing brought it into being, if there is no cause for the first cause, then did it exist from all eternity? It did. There was never a time when it sprang into being, therefore, it simply always was. Okay? Going out on a limb even a little bit more. When you think about the material universe that we live in, is there anything that you can think of that never changes, never was brought into being, never had a cause? Even planets, right? They've changed. They've been affected by, I don't know, asteroids hitting them, bumped out of orbit, I suppose. I don't know if that's possible. They move. Right? Even planets are not what they always were. And that itself has a cause. Okay? So arguably, and this is not as obvious as the first 2 points, and you could argue differently, whatever our first cause is probably not a material thing. It's not subject to the same laws and rules as everything else we know. It's something on a different scale. So, this uncaused cause we're talking about, well, you notice then, if there is an uncaused cause, and we haven't actually established this yet, there could be an infinite regress, but if it exists, then it's eternal, outside time, never was brought into being, and will never go out of being. Right? It's probably also immaterial. Okay? It's not part of this physical universe. It is something of a different order. What does that begin to sound like? It begins to sound like God. Now, of course, does this tell us everything about God? No. I mean, arguably, there could be an uncaused cause that did not become man and die on a cross. It doesn't tell us that God is all loving. It doesn't tell us that God is all good. It doesn't tell us that God rescued the Israelites from slavery. That proof won't take us that far. But it does line up with a couple key points that we believe about God, namely that he created the universe, okay, that he is the cause of everything that is, and that he is eternal, that there was no time in which he was not. And that, of course, he's on a whole other ordered being than we are. Okay? That all lines up. It's not everything, but it is significant. Okay, with me so far? Okay. So what we need to answer now is, how do we know that there wasn't an infinite regress? Of course, if there wasn't an infinite regress, if there was an end to this, then it follows something like what we call God exists. But if there was an infinite regress, then there is no need to posit such a being, at least not in this case, right? There are other proofs we'll talk about, but at least for this discussion, that would be an unnecessary hypothesis. And philosophers have wrangled over this question for centuries. Thomas Aquinas put up a somewhat interesting argument. So if you think about a set of dominoes, right? You've lined them all up, okay? If the first domino never tipped over, would the last one tip over? No. Right? If there was never any first domino to fall, then the last domino would never fall either. So essentially what Aquinas argues is the very fact that that last domino falls tells you that for there to be any falling at all, it had to start. If there was no start, again, if this is an infinite regress, then there is no effect, period. It's interesting. Is it a smoking gun proof that, yep, there's no infinite regress? It leaves some people wanting more. And in the end, Aquinas himself argues that the reason we believe there is no infinite regress is in part on faith. Right? You see in Genesis, it says God created the world, so we believe the world existed for a finite amount of time. And also it sort of just kind of naturally makes sense to us. When you're kids, you're always wondering, well, where did the universe come from? There's a certain sense that things weren't always here. But again, this is not an absolute proof. So for centuries, it was thought that it was kind of a sort of flip of the coin. Maybe it was an infinite regress. Maybe there was a beginning. Who knows? Until recently. So, in the early 1900s, because people are observing the stars, right? And I'm going to preface this by stating very clearly, my background is philosophy, and I'm stepping a little bit outside my discipline here, so please be generous. Here's my best understanding of it. They're beginning to observe galaxies that are very, 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 very far away. And a lot of these they're finding are composed of hydrogen. They know this because every atom has its own light signature. Helen, you need to correct me on this then.
Yeah, if you run them through a thing that analyzes the spectrum, each one gives you a different pattern of little lines, so you can tell which element is present.
Yeah. So they're finding hydrogen is present in a lot of these. What was interesting is that what's the guy's name? Besto Slifer. He discovered there was a red shift in what he was observing. That again, on that color spectrum, the planets he was looking at, in his group of, they said about 20, a small sample of about 20 galaxies is what I read. The light was shifted towards the red end of the spectrum. And so the question came up, well, why? Why would there be that shift? The answer they came up with was basically the Doppler effect. So, those of you who remember in science, if a cruiser is going by, right, the frequency changes as far as how your ear perceives it the closer it gets to you. So it begins to sound higher as it passes you, and that decreases as it gets further away from you, right? This is what was basically happening with the light that's being emitted from these galaxies. Because they were getting further away from us, there was a shift in the frequency. Okay. It was a lower frequency than they would have expected. Now here's the thing. Getting further away from us. This implied that the universe was expanding. And if the universe is expanding, that meant that at one time, and he was expanding from some point, that the universe at one time had not been all as spread out like this as we know it to be now, that it had been contracted. If that was the case, then that implied pretty clearly there must have been a beginning. Now, again, I am a little bit outside my field of expertise here, so I'm going to read a quote from one of the authors I've been reading. This guy's name is David Berlinski. So he writes, the inference to the Big Bang now follows. The universe that is expanding is a universe with a clear path into the past. If things are now far apart, they must at one point have been close together. And if things were once close together, they must at one point have been hotter than they are now. The contraction of space acted to compress its constituents like a vice, and so increase their energy. The retreat into the past ends in a state in which material particles are at no distance from one another, and the temperature, density, and curvature of the universe are infinite. Such a state is known as a singularity, and in the case of the cosmos, it is known as the Big Bang singularity. The cone tapering into the past must end. The lines of sight converge. The universe had a beginning. Now, this is fascinating, right? Because it solves the infinite regress problem. We know that at one point there was actually a beginning, that everything was concentrated into this one point. If all of matter, energy, if everything that existed was once concentrated into one infinitely small point, if that's even an accurate way of describing it, because, I mean, frankly, this boggles all of our concepts, right? The laws of physics don't apply to this singularity. Time doesn't exist. Space doesn't exist. Nothing that we know of exists. We can't apply logic as we know it to this concept. There is a time before everything we know. Now, this gets interesting. Because we can't observe past that point, right? Like I said, that would be the beginning of time, and it would be the beginning of space. We can only observe what is in time and space. So if anything ever existed before the singularity, we can't observe it, right? We can't trace anything before that. And so the debate, in kind of a weird way, has continued. Because, of course, for believers, this is a clear indication that, yes, there had to be an uncaused cause. We're back to that. Something caused the singularity to explode. Although, again, explode is probably not quite the right term, because this is, again, beyond our wildest conceptions. But something caused the universe to go from being infinitely concentrated to what it is now. Whatever that was could not be in, this infinitely concentrated piece of matter and energy itself, right? It had to be something outside of the system. That would look like God. this has led some to speculate that, well, then maybe there are other universes. Maybe it's not a universe, but a multiverse we're in. Maybe there's an infinite cycle of multiverses all exploding all over the place, and, well, you can't know that, right? This is pure speculation, and pure speculation to get around would be otherwise the simpler and more obvious conclusion that there appears to have been an uncaused cause that brought everything into being. I would argue that these other arguments probably violate Occam's razor. But again, at this point we're into pure speculation. So, this is the first proof I offer you. The cosmological argument that because of the way causality works, if the universe was not infinite, there must have been an uncaused cause, and that uncaused cause must look a lot like God. Now, there's another part of the universe that needs explaining. And that's the fact that there's any order in it at all. All right? So we're used to the idea that there are laws of physics, right? That we can predict that what comes up must go down. And no matter how many times I do this, the same thing's going to happen. It's a consistent law. It's the way things are ordered. That the sun will continue to come up and go down every day. It's just the way things are ordered. That the water cycle will continue to go just exactly the way it's been going. And the fact that the water cycle continues to work enables us to continue to live. We just take that for granted, that there are certain rules and laws and order that's built right into the very fabric of the world we live in. But when you think about this is odd. Right? I don't know if any of you had this problem when you were kids, but every once in a while, my room would get a little bit messy. And I can tell you exactly how it happened. I would come in there, and I'd drop a pile of papers at some fairly random place. And figure I'll take care of that later. And I'd drop another pile of stuff over another place, another pile of stuff over and another, and over the course of weeks or so, it was a complete and total mess. And of course, my mother would eventually come up and take a look, and I'd get some comments to the effect of, well, gee, this room's not going to clean itself. Well, to be an annoying philosopher, why not? Right? Why, if the room can make itself messy, right? If dropping papers randomly here and there creates a mess, well, why not dropping them randomly? Why wouldn't dropping them randomly create order? It's random. We assume when we see order that someone has done something, right? Order doesn't just happen. When there are laws, it's because someone's given those laws, right? The fact that people stop at red lights is not because, I don't know, it's a pretty color and they like to look at it. It's because the government has said you will stop at a red light. That's what created that order. Okay? But apart from that law, would people stop at red lights? No. No, the order was imposed. And if any of you have been to, I don't know, places like India, when the order is not imposed, people don't stop at red lights. It's perfectly chaotic. I'll give you another example. If you were walking through a forest and you saw branches lying on the floor of the forest, would you think twice about it? Would you think that someone artistically came by and carefully placed each branch in a particular location just to make it look nice? No, right? It's chaos. It's random. There's no need to explain it. Conversely, if you see a log cabin in a forest, do you then conclude, well, the branches just randomly fell into just the right place, and therefore, log cabin? It's theoretically conceivable that maybe things just fell in the right way, but the odds are so slim, we assume that because it has that shape and that purpose, and again, that order, somebody must have made it with a particular order and intention. Well, the laws of nature are like this. Okay? Our universe, again, has predictable laws and a predictable order. Things don't just happen randomly, which is odd. not only do they not happen randomly, they work together in this surprisingly neat kind of way. Animals feed off plants, we feed off animals. Rain falls, drains off into the river, which then gets evaporated up into clouds. The rain falls again. The sun, when it's not raining, shines and grows the plants that were watered by the rain. Everything works together so intricately. And it looks like everything has its place and purpose. If anything was out of place, things would be a complete mess. And this is part of the deal with the environmental crisis, is things about the created universe are being taken out of place, and yes, it's creating a complete mess. The order is intricate, but very real. So when you observe that degree of order and complexity, the natural conclusion is someone must have created it with that order and purpose. That in fact this wasn't all random. This is known as the watchmaker argument. This is found originally with William Paley, where he argues that if you saw a clock sitting in the middle of a field, right, you would never conclude that it was there by random chance, that the pieces just happened to come together. It's too complicated. It has a very clear function and purpose. Because of that, you assume that someone must have made it with said function and purpose. It doesn't just assume that on its own. And same thing with the universe. Now, interesting side note. It seems that this was a fairly persuasive argument through the late 1700s. And you can see this particularly in the influence of deism. So, if you're familiar with deism, deists concluded that there was indeed a God who created the universe. But, you know, they called him the watchmaker God. They winded the watch and then just let it run. So they didn't believe in miracles. They didn't believe in the supernatural. They didn't believe Jesus was God. But intellectually, they couldn't get around this problem of the Creator. The world was too complex and too intricately ordered to be able to explain without positing that, yes, something created it. Now, that was as far as they were willing to go. These are not people who otherwise would want to be believers. If you ever look at the Jefferson Bible, this is kind of, to my mind, clear proof of it. He cut out every reference to the supernatural in it. It's kind of fun to look at, actually. But there's also this sense that they were sort of looking for an out, right? They would love to poke holes in the arguments for the existence of God, and they poked as many as they possibly could. But that was one that stood. They couldn't quite seem to find a way around it. Until you get to Darwin. So for those of you who have wondered why evolution is such a flashpoint, this is my speculation, but I think that's part of why. That was, for many people, the last thing standing between them and unbelief. And when they found an out on that, they were very happy to take it. So, again, here's the basic issue. The intricate order of the universe needs to be explained somehow. Just saying this happened randomly just isn't satisfying. It'd be like saying, I took a fistful of sand, threw it up, and oh look, a sandcastle happened. Just this randomly came together. No, something has to explain it. And what Darwin and, I was going to say his successors, but that's not quite the right word. Darwin and people who followed him said was natural selection is sufficient to explain this. Right? So one way of thinking about this is I think of it as like a new boss taking over. Okay? A couple years after the boss takes over, you look around, it's like, wow, everybody in this room is now on the same page as the boss. I wonder what happened. Well, what happened is everybody who wasn't on the same page with the boss is gone. And that's kind of the idea with natural selection. We're looking around and saying, oh, wow, everything that's here just fits perfectly. There's nothing out of place. And the argument with natural selection is, yes, that's because everything that was out of place died off and is gone. So this was held up as sort of the elegant alternative to belief in God. There are issues, however. Now, again, as with all the person going to offer, they're not smoking gun obvious beyond controversy. So, again, no, I'm not presenting this dogmatically. But a few interesting things to think about. So, 1, natural selection depends on random mutation. So the idea is you have a bunch of different possible genetic combinations that have cropped up in species over time, right? And some work and some don't, okay? But you begin with sort of a bumper crop of random mutations that all come together as possibilities. Well, here's one issue. It sounds nice, but let's look at the odds of the particular possibilities that were chosen actually happening. They're very, very small. For all the factors to come together to create life as we know it on this planet, I mean, the odds are tiny. I'll read you this passage here. The guy I'm reading to you from, this guy's name is Gerald Schroeder. He has his doctorate from MIT. He's an interesting character because he knows the physics pretty well, but he also studied, he's Jewish, and he studied the Hebrew Bible extensively, so he knows the scripture side of it very well, and he also has a pretty good grasp on the science side. So anyway, so here's what he said. So with the universe, we did not just win one lottery, okay? So random mutations producing something that would work for life is a little bit like winning the lottery. It'd be one thing to win it once. Say we did not just win one lottery, we wanted the choice for the strength of the electromagnetic force, which encourages atoms to join to molecules. So if the strength of the electromagnetic force was a little bit off, that would throw everything into a problematic state. We wanted the strength of the strong nuclear force, which holds atomic nuclei together. Were it a bit stronger, the diproton and not hydrogen would be the major component of the universe, and no hydrogen means no shining stars. Other winning lotteries were the strength of the weak nuclear force and the strength of gravity, which dominates the universe at distances greater than the size of molecules and clusters mass into galaxy stars and planets. We wanted the mass and energy of the Big Bang, the temperature of the Big Bang, the rate of expansion of the universe, and much more. Lottery upon lottery and all winners. They have meshed to produce the wonderful world in which we live. By chance? Not if our understanding of the laws of nature is even approximately correct. To this observer of nature, our universe looks like a put-up job. I'm not alone in that opinion. Molecular biologist and observant Catholic, Professor Michael Day, stated the case for believing biologists. He says you can be a good Catholic and believe in Darwinism, that is, random mutations of genes sifted by nature's selection. Biochemistry has made it increasingly difficult, however, to be a thoughtful scientist and believe in it. So yes, is there a small chance that this could all have randomly cropped up? There's a chance. But when you look at the actual numbers, and at least as presented by Schroeder, because, again, philosopher, I could not run the numbers myself, we were looking at chances that are worse than a monkey sitting down to a typewriter and happening to produce Hamlet. It's possible, but it's very, very small. So small that we tend to think it impossible. So, if the odds are so strongly against this happening randomly, then we begin to think, well, maybe it wasn't random. Now, exactly how God did it, that's a different question. We can say that he specially created each creature. That we can believe on faith. But Genesis also allows that perhaps he wired into his creation a certain, we would say, teleology. That each creature had a certain end that it was supposed to grow into and adapt into. And everything was tending towards that end. You could argue that too. But one way or the other, it seems like the development of the universe was directed in a particular way. And if it's directed, there must, of course, be a director. Questions about this? Now here's the last proof that I'm going to present to you. And this is one of my favorites. It's nothing like the other two. So this one's called the ontological argument. And it operates differently than the others. The others, like I said, were basically like tracing the footprints of God. And the footprints that we saw were basically reflected on God as creator. This one isn't exactly tracing the footprints. The argument, in fact, is that God exists by definition. So follow me here. So, by definition, we'll say that God is that than which nothing greater can be thought. Okay? So, if you picture every form of greatness you can imagine, right? So, greatness in terms of length of time, okay? Infinite time. Greatness in terms of power, perfect power. Okay? Greatness in terms of love, perfect love. Right? Every greatness you can even think of, picture that, and that's what we mean by God. Okay? That than which nothing greater can be thought. If you can think of something greater than that, then that's God. Okay? So, everybody okay with this definition? Right. Now, a second claim to you. It is greater for something to exist not only in thought, but also in reality. Okay? So, for instance, ice cream. The idea of ice cream is wonderful. Let's be honest here. I mean, the thought of it makes me hungry, it makes me happy. Wonderful. But, however wonderful the thought of ice cream is, and the idea of ice cream, oh, the actual existence of ice cream is so much better. Okay? It is greater for ice cream to actually exist in reality than just as an idea. Now, so far, we've only spoken about God as just an idea, right? He is that than which nothing greater can be thought. The greatest idea we can possibly have. However, if God is that than which nothing greater can be thought, well, isn't it greater for him to actually exist? And if that's part of the definition, then by definition, God must exist not only as an idea, but also actually exist. There's the proof. God by definition exists. It's super clever. I don't know if it's made many converts, but it is so clever.
St. Anselm.
Yeah, this originally comes from St. Anselm. It's quite fun. St. Anselm actually begins this whole thing with a quote from the Psalms. The fool says in his heart, there is no God. And then the whole argument then goes on as his reply to the fool. And the fool happens to have a name. His name is Galnilo. So there's a little back and forth between the two of them. Now, this is one of those things that drives philosophers nuts, because it seems to be a valid argument, and yet at the same time, it's kind of like it's a valid, but it's also not persuasive. It's like, well, because you told me by definition God exists, it doesn't automatically make people believe in God. And so philosophers always want to undermine this and say, well, gee, just because I say a beautiful island exists doesn't mean, or just because I have an idea of a beautiful island doesn't make the island exist. It's like, well, yeah, but it doesn't apply to the island. It only applies to that than which nothing greater can be thought. So they always try to find a way around it. But in the end, Immanuel Kant pointed out that it's sort of a moot point because nobody dies for the ontological argument. This is not ultimately what faith is grounded in. I would argue to you as well, most people don't die for the cosmological argument either, or the argument through intelligent design. What people really die for is that encounter with God. They come to know Jesus Christ, they come to know love itself, and that they cannot doubt. But again, for people who have not had the encounter, these arguments are at least helpful. And of course, the joy with footprints is if you trace the footprints far enough, what are you likely to find? The thing itself. If you trace the footprints of God long enough, eventually, God himself. There's the hope. Does anybody have any questions? Would you like to?
My head just hurts.
That's why I like science. It's clear cut, it has reason. Philosophy, on the other hand, is so twisted and difficult. I mean, I took a philosophy class in college, and I was not very good at it.
Yeah.
It's hard.
Yeah. Philosophy can be somewhat. Philosophy can be very abstract. I would also argue there are types of philosophers. There are some people who just love sounding smart. May God have mercy on their soul. So always be careful when you read philosophy, because it varies so much depending on which person you're talking to, what type of philosophy is going to be presented. Some people love convoluted terms and phrases and really weird, wacky ideas that no one can really wrap their minds around. And I find that especially with modern philosophy. I find it painful. But then there are other philosophers who are much more earthy. Like you read Aristotle and Plato, you can trace back and see, okay, these are the concrete experiences that they're trying to explain. This is where they're getting their principles from. I can figure this out. And same thing with the medievals, honestly, too. The medievals are pretty, I find them pretty earthy as well. You can trace back and see, oh, that's what they're seeing. This is where they're getting their principles from. Oh, I recognize that.
It was a modern philosophy class that I took.
Yeah, that hurts.
I have a funny story about the footprints thing, which may have application that, you see what you want to see no matter what is there. My imbecile dachshund knew that by nature it was to hunt animals, they were built to, especially the small ones are called Peninsula-Hund, and they were bunny hounds. They were supposed to go hunt bunnies. The poor thing knew it should do this, but it was very unclear on the concept. So there was this rabbit that used to come and sit by the bird feeder, and in the wintertime, the thing would hop through the snow, and his little footprints would be there, and he'd be sitting up in the bird feeder area munching, and the dachshund would come. He would follow the footprints, snip, 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 and the rabbit would be waiting for death, sitting there on the rock. And the dog would get right up to the rabbit and was like, "Thing, you're on the footprints, go away." And it would follow the new footprints. God could be right there. And people follow the footprints right to him, and it's like, well, no, not you. Go, not you. I do the footprint thing, go away. So,
Has anybody read the book The Great Divorce? I knew, yeah. It's a book by C.S. Lewis. It's basically, Lewis is discussing basically the question of how can a merciful God allow hell to exist. And his thesis is that human beings freely choose hell. That there are things that they'll cling to even at the price of misery, even if it, leaves them in hell itself. So one of his characters is a great theologian. And he's so obsessed with his studies of God. And he has all these convoluted ideas about the supreme being, okay? And again, part of the idea of the book is the idea that the souls in hell have a chance to go to heaven, and there are people sent from heaven to persuade them, please come with us. God is waiting for you. It's so nice up there. But they won't let go of their harebrained ideas, even if it means they could go to heaven. And so this guy is feels so self-enlightened. I have learned, I've read all this stuff, and I've gone beyond all this old moldy theology, and I know that there's a supreme being, and I refuse to call him God, and all this stuff. And this guy from heaven is trying to tell him, no, the old theology was right. I'm coming to you from heaven. He's real. Go run to him. Oh no, we don't believe in that. And then there's a line later in the book. There are people who are so caught up in proving the existence of God that they forget that God has more to do than just exist. It's worth bearing in mind. And oh goodness, this is a danger for philosophers too. But
The
Wait.
rabbit holes.
Ian,
But Joe, isn't part of the problem because human beings live in a manifest world and things that should be tangible, and the cosmic consciousness
Yep.
that's infinite,
yeah,
that if you can't see it and grab it, you're still gonna get people in the same crowd and still have people. And if you don't have that,
yeah,
I don't know what to call it energy, but that, I'm not gonna call it energy that you've absorbed
yeah.
and translated into your being, then pretty hard.
Yeah. So I would argue it's much more tangible than a lot of people think. And that the problem is that a lot of people just don't know where to look or don't want to look. That too. So for instance, like when you think of Padre Pio, right? The things that people saw happen with Padre Pio are very tangible. So for those of you who are not familiar, Padre Pio had the stigmata for 50 years. And he died only in 1968. So between 1918 and 1968, hundreds, thousands of people could see, yeah, there are holes in those hands. That's very tangible. There are people who saw him say Mass, and there's one man who watched him say Mass and saw a crown of thorns placed on his head at the beginning of the Mass. There are other people who went to confession to him, and he told them their sins before they even confessed them. There are others who saw him in New York City, in Africa, in Rome, when he never left San Giovanni Rotunda. You know, these are very tangible things. Now, of course, people can see these tangible things and still find ways around it if they want to. Oh, you know, this is just mass hysteria. Oh, these things don't happen. Oh, those holes probably, Padre Pio probably did it himself. None of this makes much sense. But if you're willing, if what you want to do is to excuse the possibility of the supernatural out of hand, you can jump through all kinds of hoops to do it. And there is, well, yeah, I don't know. I guess that'd be my thoughts on it. There is a sense in which you need to take a leap of faith, even just to accept the possibility that this is a possibility. But once you allow for the possibility, I find a lot can come into focus really, really fast. And all
Your consciousness has to connect with that.
yeah, you have to be okay with it. So I think I told you, it was last week, I told you guys about my own encounter with the Blessed Sacrament. And it bothered me for quite a while. Why is it that one day I look at the Blessed Sacrament and all I see is bread, and then the next day it could not be more obvious to me that this is Jesus Christ himself physically in front of me? How could that possibly be? What I concluded is that effectively before this I was basically blind. I was like a guy who was standing right in front of Jesus with the eyes to his heart closed. People could tell me that, yes, that's Jesus standing right in front of you, but I was so convinced that that was a just complete impossibility that I simply wouldn't listen to it. And it didn't matter how much evidence was thrown at me, I would not have believed it. I would have found every possible reason to say that's absurd. It was only in the moment where finally I said, wait, what if it's possible? And that was, frankly, that was as far as I got. It was just, on a deep level, what if this is possible? That it became patently obvious it was right in front of my eyes. But yeah, I think that dynamic is real for a lot of people. And sometimes they're not even aware of it. They inherit this as part of our culture. They inherit this as just part of the way they've been taught the world works, that they think it's a prior impossibility that God could exist or do anything supernatural. And they're not even aware of the prejudice. But it does keep them from seeing things that otherwise would be, right in front of their nose. I don't know if that...
Oh, yeah, no, I'm saying that that's why, in a versus society, some people may not believe or believe at a lesser level.
Yeah.
Because we live in a tangible world. I'm not saying that's good, it's not good,
Yeah.
but I'm just saying it's, because we're so much, we're inundated by tangible, manifest things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Particularly if you're not, you never close your eyes and pray, and, makes it even more difficult.
This is true. This is true.
But then again, some people are blessed from birth. This resonates with them.
Yeah. Yeah, I find too, kids seem a lot more open to faith than adults. And it's interesting. I remember I was talking with one friend of mine. One of the joys of being a lifeguard is you have all sorts of time to talk about the meaning of life. Because at Willard Beach, nobody ever drowns. So we were sitting there, theoretically guarding the beach, but actually talking about all sorts of philosophical stuff that high schoolers like to get into. And it was interesting to talk to him because he'd kind of fallen away from the faith, but in talking with him, he was talking about, when I was a little kid, I used to believe and I was so happy, and the world made so much more sense, and I don't know what happened. Kids are innocent, and so there's nothing keeping them away from Jesus. Their hearts are completely open to him. That's why I love the Fatima children so much. They're perfect innocence. There's no barriers between them and God. They haven't put any up. Over time, those barriers tend to get in there. We become skeptical, we become cynical. Sins hold us back. That happens all the time where people get caught up in sin and they don't want to let that go. And they know they'll stay away from church forever, not because they're intellectually convinced that God isn't real. It's because if he is real, then they have to change things, and they're not ready to do that. Or they get caught up in, sometimes, again, people are so convinced they're so smart. And they get wedded to this ideology. And if God is real, all these grand ideas they have are undermined. And it's not because, again, they have any great rational justification that God isn't real. It's that his existence threatens things that they really want to hold on to. So the human heart is funny. It often sees what it wants to see, nothing more. And of course, God gets around that. You look at St. Paul, for instance. St. Paul was, very tightly closed heart to Jesus Christ. And what Jesus Christ had to do is throw him off his horse, blind him, and say, "Why are you persecuting me? Stop it." Which got through to him. But until then, you could argue till you're blue in the face with Saul, and he wouldn't have changed his mind. There was something in him that wanted to cling regardless of the truth. Any other thoughts, questions? All right, well, as always, thank you all for coming. Next week we have our last session. It'll be on the problem of evil. I feel like we're ending on kind of a dark note, but that's okay. I'll see you next week, I hope.
Thank you.
Very good. Nice job.
I guess you can't. I'll wait till Tuesday.
Okay, we should be able. Yeah, I'll give you a ticket. You go to the website, watch Mass, then go to Watch Mass Live.
Okay.
Yep. And then
That's on Facebook too. Watch Mass Live.
these don't get put up on Facebook.
Okay.
So you have to go to the website, Watch Mass Live, and then at the top, it's the top window that says Watch Mass in Adoration. click on that. It'll say nothing streaming right now. And then go to recent broadcasts. And that's a little button on the, within the black window. And then that will show Catholic Apologetics as one of the options. And that's the one. It's really scrolling.
Yeah, I'll try it again.
Oops.